Over the past few weeks, I've been working on this diorama inspired by the Battle of France in World War II. This week, I'm going to be starting the groundwork and basically finishing this diorama up. I started by applying AK's Terrain Muddy Ground over a carved XPS foam board. This will help give the foam a more realistic texture. Plus, it'll help protect the foam for the coming steps. It's also sticky enough when it's wet that I can press in some bricks that I've made in previous videos. Once those are in place, I start using larger stones and place them around where I think they'd be up against walls, up against other rocks, and along the riverbed, just making it look as natural as possible. Then I use some ballast from railroad modeling for smaller stones, and then I finish it off with some sand. The more texture, the better. This is going to give it a much more realistic finish when we blend it all in together. Now I used AK's Light Earth. If you didn't have this, you could just use either one of these pastes, or you could make your own. The point is, cover the foam so it doesn't look like foam. I did the same process after I applied all of this with the brick sections, and you can see some of the stones I've put in as well. Just make sure you know exactly where you want to put things before you press them in, because that can be kind of a pain to clean up after. You can see using the lighter paste on the higher ground is going to give that a little bit more of a highlight after. Now, once everything is dry, I use the muddy ground again to blend everything in together so it doesn't look like the rocks are just sitting on the terrain. To place this section in, I wanted to make sure that I had everything in place, so I temporarily attached the back wall, but I left it removable for now, so I have easier access for the coming steps. And here again, just blending everything together, so it doesn't look like it's sitting on top of the terrain, and it kind of blends in together. Some of these tracks I wanted to make a little darker, so I used some diluted paste for that. Next, it was time to bring some life into this diorama, and that is in the form of static grass. To start, I used some matte Mod Podge, and I left it on nice and thick so the grass would have something to adhere to. I then put a blend of 6mm grass into my custom-made static grass applicator, and I went over the entire base with that. If you don't have one of these applicators, you could pick one up, or you could try and put this on by hand, just by holding a clump at a time. It would take longer for sure, but you would get very similar results. Remember to reuse that grass for next time. And then I like to go over the entire thing and kind of tease that grass back up, because it is static, so the grass kind of goes everywhere, even though it is mostly pointed up. You want to make sure you kind of get it persuaded in that direction, just so it looks a little bit more realistic. Then we went back through into some of the areas that are closer to the walls and made a few more clumps of a shorter, darker grass. And this is a 2mm, and we applied that over the entire base as well. And once everything is dry, I start blending in all of the grass and terrain together. I tried not to hit the already painted stones and bricks, but again, a little overspray kind of helps tie everything together. I don't go crazy with this step, just a blending step. So at first we started with the black brown, then highlights of orange brown, and now we're just pulling out some of that green to make the grass look more like grass. And this just makes it look a little bit more realistic, and it makes it look like the model that eventually is going to sit on this isn't out of place. I think sometimes when you use synthetic materials like the static grass that aren't painted, it kind of has an almost too real quality to it that kind of stands out against the model that you've meticulously painted and tried to make look realistic. So that's why I paint all the grass. Now I just went back through and pulled out some highlights in those bricks that got a little bit too much overspray on them. And I picked out individual stones to really make them pop. As you can see here, everything looks a little flat. And to give it a little bit more depth and dimension, I go through with a wet palette and a few different colors. I just pick out some of the stones that have been too well blended into the scene and make them look like they were their correct color. This is surprisingly a pretty relaxing process. It looks a little tedious, but once you get into it, it actually is kind of fun. It also really makes a huge difference. Now it was time to adhere the back to the base, and you can see now it all looks like it's really coming together. It's important to blend these two sections together. And the reason I didn't do this before was because there was absolutely no way I was going to get my static grass applicator into those areas if there was a wall in the back. So I ended up redoing a couple of steps, like having to repaint some of the stones, but that's all right. Again, keep it on a wet palette and you won't have to remix any colors. These are our amazing trees that we made in a previous video. And I wanted to create some vines hanging out of the wall, maybe some roots from these trees. So I mixed up some milliput and just kind of blended them back into this area so they didn't look just like wire. I just didn't cover the entire thing, but I covered everything that it would kind of attach to and just give it a little bit more texture. Let's see there, adding little pieces. And there you go, some beautiful wire and milliput vines. Obviously, wanted to blend the tree into the ground. That's pretty important to make the tree look realistic. And then started to base coat those vines so they blended in as well. I also blended the tree into the wall with some milliput as well and kind of painted that up so it would blend in and would look as realistic as possible. Did a little dry brushing. Basically did all the steps I did on the trees. And then I added some little bit of foam to look like moss on the base of the tree and kind of coming out of the wall. I thought that added another layer of organic material. Speaking of which, that was on to all of the plants that were going to live in this environment. Here are the last of my laser cut ferns, which I'm going to need to get more of at some point. You can see things like this. They're a little expensive. You can get a lot of different varieties of plants like that, but they really are great. I also wanted to add in a mixture of plants that I dried from last season and some seafoam trees. I took all of these that I found interesting and decided to paint them up to look like flowers. You could paint these in any way you wanted. I thought these looked like sunflowers or some sort of daisy, so I just painted those up with some yellow. And these other ones had more of a shrub-like texture, so I painted those green. And then with the seafoam trees, I went through and did the same process as we did on the larger trees we made, except doing individual leaves, we used a couple of different types of foam. So a darker foam for the base, and then after that, stippled on a little bit more glue and dipped them in the lighter foam. And that could be the different shades of green on it, or some sunlight, or it could be some flowers. So you could really have fun with these if you wanted to. And then it's time to make them look more like individual plants and not a collection of weeds and flowers. So broke them all up and kind of got an idea of what I had to work with. I used a pin vise to make some pre-drilled holes and just dipped those in some glue and placed them in. After this point, it's important to notice that these are pretty delicate, so you're going to want to be very careful with the base after this. Obviously, when the tree is in, you want to be careful around that as well, but the further along you get with these dioramas, the more detail you add, the more careful you have to be. But I just added things until it looked natural. I put ferns in the shade and flowers in the sun. And then it was on to add some texture to the ground with leaf litter and debris that probably would have fallen from the tree and over the years. So I used some tea that I had left over, and I just sprinkled that everywhere as leaf litter and all of that natural looking debris, because that's what it is. It is interesting to note that when I poured the resin in the riverbed, we did get some of that color to seep out, which was kind of nice. It actually worked really well to make it a little murkier. And we just added some other leaves from the tree as well. And then set everything in place with some matte Mod Podge and water after we sprayed it with some isopropyl alcohol. And that just locks everything in place and protects it for the next step. Well, since this is going to be a base for a tank driving through a river, I figured that the area where the tracks had been and where the tank was driving would be wet. So we added some damp earth and streaking grime to the base. And then it was time for the resin pour, which a lot of the footage for this was pretty boring because it's a lot of sitting and waiting, but there were plenty of little leaks that needed to be filled, and it didn't really make sense to film everything. But just know that when you're going to put any sort of resin on foam, make sure it is sealed 1000%, and then go back through and make sure it's sealed again, because the last thing you want is this to eat through your foam base after you've put hours and hours and hours into it. It's not that big of a deal here. I had to fill some of the holes with some stone and things like that, but it was kind of a 2 or 3 day nightmare to get this completely set and level. This realistic water that I used from Woodland Scenics was great, and I just did it in a few pours. And you can see there where it leaked out, but all in all, it worked great. I used this aluminum tape. I thought that would be helpful. It really wasn't that helpful. It was a little too sticky, so it wasn't peeling away from the top. So I went back through and I peeled it from the bottom first, and that actually worked much better. It's not the cleanest edges, but that's not really what I was going for here. It's more the river in the middle of the diorama than the sides. So I just painted that up, and it's not that big of a deal. But here again, I had to go from the bottom. You can see all of the areas where it leaked, but it's kind of satisfying to pull that off there. Another thing to notice is that area there, there was some Mod Podge underneath there that kind of rehydrated when the water went in, and that eventually needed to just be covered up because it either never dried or it dried with that gloss. So another thing to remember, just make sure everything is 100% dry and 100% sealed before you start a pour. And if you're not filming it for YouTube, you should have plenty of time to let it wait and dry completely. Just touching up some of the areas that were messed up by the tape. And there we go. That is the riverbed poured. And the next step is going to be making it muddy where the tank crossed. So I added some plaster, again, because I was running out of time and I needed it to dry quickly. Things like celluclay take much longer to dry, but are a little easier to manipulate. This was pretty straightforward, so I felt confident to use just some plaster that I tinted a nice dark brown. And then just laid it all over all that work I had just done. But we're going to need a level base for the tank to sit on, and I needed to bring this mud level up. And once that was dry, I added the muddy earth texture back over top of that, so that would blend back in. The reason I tinted the plaster was just in case anything came through, and it wouldn't look so stark white, and it kind of acted as a primer. But here I was just trying to make it look like mud had been kind of pushed away by the treads as it went through. I don't know how realistic this is, where the mud is a little bit proud of the surface of the water, but at this point there's really no turning back, and the tank needs to sit flush and look like it is sunken into the ground and not floating on top of it. So it is what it is. But it'll look fine. You won't even notice it when the tank is on there. I just thought I would point out all of my mistakes. And again, after that, I wanted to make sure everything looked wet and give some ripples to the water, so it wasn't such a flat surface. And did the old Mod Podge with the airbrush trick, and went over all of the areas that I thought would be wet from a tank just passing through. And that's it. After finishing up the river with some snowflakes that look like ripples, that was going to be it for this base. Next video, we are going to finish up the tank and place it in, and we will be done with this diorama. I hope you enjoyed watching this whole process. I had a ton of fun doing this and making this really come to life. I hope it inspired you and gave you some ideas to at least put some vegetation or mud around your next model. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked it, please give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss next video. I'll see you then.